in here. I'm Lori Krupp. I'll be your facilitator today. I get to work at NCR as the Donor Engagement Officer. And Olga here is my lovely colleague, one of our newer members of staff. It hasn't quite been a year yet. I think you came in October. Is that about?
September. So okay. About to be a year. Wow, time really has flown. Almost a year. It's going to be a year this September. Mm-hmm.
That's exciting. So, okay. Olga, one thing I want to mention to you is I'm keeping my notes on the left here, my left. So if it looks to you like I'm distracted, I'm just looking at my notes, okay?
Cool. Yes, I do the same thing. And I should probably let people know I'm not ignoring them and looking off screen because I do that as well. I keep my notes sort of to the side.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really great to have everybody here today, especially, I don't know, in light of the last few weeks, I just have personally experienced a real need to be connecting with people who I experience as having the same values and just can really get into talking about what does it mean to live a life of faith in this world today and the unique challenges and opportunities that we all have. So thank you for being here. So with that in mind, Olga, just a few words about you. I like to think of you as a creative. Mm-hmm. You are a passionate person with much talent. You're a wonderful writer. You've been written by many respected journals in the country, and most importantly, of course, ours. Hello.
Of course.
You're a new author, which we're here to talk about today. So we are delighted that you're with us. I'm going to ask you to tell your own story, so I'm not going to do a lot by way of introduction right now. So with that, Olga, can I ask you, you had mentioned you have a reflection for us to begin, and then off we'll go.
Sure. So first, I just want to say thank you for everyone, to everyone who's tuning in to see me speak today. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so I'm really excited to be in this very specific type of community today. And I, like a lot of people this past year, my faith and prayer life has kind of been all over the place. So I decided to share with you guys today a poem that really sort of speaks to me and helps me, for lack of a better word, speak to God when I can't really find the words myself. And this is a poem called Therapy by the poet Nayira Wahid. So I'm just going to read it to you all, and I hope that you use her words to kind of center yourselves for the community we're going to be in today. So, the hard season will split you through. Do not worry. You will bleed water. Do not worry. This is grief. Your face will fall out and down your skin, and there will be scorching. But do not worry. Keep speaking the years from their hiding places. Keep coughing up smoke from all the deaths you have died. Keep the rage tender, because the soft season will come. It will come, loud, ready, gulping, both hands in your chest, up all night, up all of the nights, to drink all damage into love. So that's just a poem that she's one of my favorite poems, Nayira Wahid, and I find myself returning to her words often in the past year, especially in the months after the book, when it seems as if my anxiety is really, really high, but my spiritual life is really low. And so I hope that spoke to you guys today before we enter into a conversation about my book and about the work that I'm doing. So.
I love how you said that, Olga, when my anxiety is higher, my spirituality is low. That is, yeah. Oh. You just kind of named it for me. Before I ask you the first question, Olga, we're here to talk about a matter that's very important to us. And what I'd like to ask you to do is, as I ask you questions or offer my own thought, I invite you to use my words as any kind of teaching moment as well. So if I ask a question in a way that's maybe not the best way to ask it or unintentionally insulting, I invite you to use my words as well, if that would help.
No. Of course, thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So first question, just tell us a little about yourself, how you came to be the amazing woman you are today.
Sure. So this might seem a little repetitive to some folks, especially if you read the book, because I get into it a little bit, but I was born in the Dominican Republic in 1989, and my family arrived in New York in the early 90s. And I like to start from here because now in hindsight, as an adult person, I can look back at all the ways that I've kind of just been a writer since I arrived in this country. So I like to start from there because my family arrived in the early 90s and nobody spoke English. My parents didn't speak English. I didn't speak English. It took me 3 months to learn the language. And once I did, I struggled with it a lot. I struggled to learn how to spell words. I struggled to communicate in a language that was still very new to me. And at the same time, my parents were also struggling with this language. My parents were also struggling to figure out how to teach themselves English. They were very educated in the Dominican Republic. Then you come here and the language is a very, very real barrier. So I'm learning the language myself, learning how to, at a very young age, navigate these New York Bronx spaces that were really new to me. And so I started to develop what I sort of get into a little in the book. I became a translator for my parents in many, many instances, especially for my mom. My mom still to this day is not quote unquote 100% fluent in English, but my interactions with having to help my parents navigate that world was really what kind of gave me the sensibilities that made me the writer I would become later on in life, because I had to become really attuned at a young age to not just what people were trying to say in a very specific moment, but what they might be thinking of saying without even realizing themselves. So I really had to step into a role that taught me to write in a way that wasn't the usual teaching to write in school, right? I didn't go to journalism school. I'm someone who has just been surrounded by storytellers and surrounded by Black immigrants who have really struggled to figure out what it means to assimilate when you don't know the language. And so we grew up in the Bronx. I was raised in the Bronx, went to Catholic schools my whole life. I went to Fordham University and I graduated in 2011 with a degree in English and Italian, and still not fully calling myself a writer. I thought, oh my God, what is my vocation going to be? I was at a really lost time, not just spiritually, but also professionally. I graduated in 2011 and it was very, very difficult for my generation to find jobs. And so I kind of entered the Catholic media space at America. And that was really where I began to think, oh, okay, you do have a voice. You have a voice and you can tell stories that other people are not telling in this world. And so I became really interested in covering racial justice and especially covering this movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, that was created at a time when I myself was coming of age post-college. And this movement really gave me the lens to talk about what it means to be Black in this country, what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be all of those things also in the Catholic Church. And so I started writing about that, and then I got a book deal. So sort of that's like the short version of who I am and how I got led to that book. But just growing up in a family of writers really that is what taught me to think about writing, thinking about what it means to be Catholic. And that has played a role in everything I do, from the book to my work as the culture editor at NCR. So that's a little bit about my writing journey.
Well, even this book was a journey, because I learned during our preparation for this session that this wasn't the book you were originally asked to write.
Yep. It was a very, very different book. When I was at America, I wrote an article I started writing it in 2018. And it was finally published in 2019. And that was the first time, after a few years of reporting on this movement, that article was the first time that I actually talked to one of the founders of the movement. I talked to Alicia Garza. And so I had a conversation with one of the members where I was like, okay, I'm in this very Catholic space. How can Catholics think about this movement? Why should Catholics think about this movement? Why should everyone be thinking about this movement? And so I wrote that article. And I envisioned the book, that was the article that ultimately got me my book contract. And I envisioned the book to be very similar to the work I had been doing up until that point. I thought, okay, I'm going to lay out this movement. I'm going to outline what this movement is about, who these people are, and why Catholics should care about it. And I was hoping, this was me at the time, I was like, okay, this is going to be a sort of gentle, polite wake-up call to white Catholics in particular to really start thinking about this work. And then this was in 2019. I wrote the first outline for the book in April of 2019, and I didn't start writing the actual book until May of 2020. So shortly after George Floyd's death and in the middle of lockdown, quarantine in New York City, and in the middle of so much social distancing in this global pandemic. And then the book could no longer just be this very very, very gentle wake-up call to Catholics. The book became as militant and as sort of desperate as I myself was feeling. I was seeing everything that was happening all around me, and I was struggling to process what it meant to say, okay, I am a Black Catholic millennial immigrant woman in this church, and I'm feeling all these very intense, desperate things about what my identity means at this moment and how our identities are threatened in this moment. And I need white people to wake up to that as well. And I wanted people to understand that when we talk about racial justice, it's not just, hey, here's the work that we're doing. Here are these brilliant thinkers who are helping us to think about this work. It's also, when I'm done talking about this, when I'm done editing a piece on this, when I'm done talking in events like this, I still carry the anxiety and the burden of trying to be a person of color in this space. And there were moments in 2020 in particular where that was extremely, extremely devastating and extremely difficult for me to reconcile with my faith. And it still is. It's still very hard for me to wake up every day and say, I'm really committed to liberation, I'm committed to freedom, but also it's exhausting and it's painful. And so I wanted to give white Catholics a look into that. I wanted people to also know that my generation has already experienced a lot since we graduated college. The market has not been kind to us. We're not saving, we're not buying homes. And I was politicized in 2020, like so many people in my generation, in a very, very new way. And I became more of a Catholic leftist than I ever would have thought. When I first outlined this book, I was very much in my, I'm a Catholic liberal, and there are things that I'm really progressive about, and there are things that I will push the envelope with. And then 2020 happened, and I was like, oh, no. Like, what it means to be a Christian in this moment, it means talking about abolition. It means talking about defunding the police. It means talking about all these very, very difficult things in the context of our church. And I think that my own political awakening is probably what changed the book the most, because I was moved in a way that I never thought I'd be moved politically. And it was terrifying because it's really, really scary to sit with American history and also what was happening in the present and realize, oh my God, there's so much work to be done. This is really, really scary. But it's also extremely important to provide that context. And I wanted readers who are engaging with the book to understand that these are all of the various things that were kind of happening in my mind while I was trying to create this book.
You know, when we were talking about the book a few weeks ago, I mentioned to you that I experienced it like I was being taken on a journey as I read. And you had mentioned, that you were happy to hear that because that was exactly your hope. Will you talk to me about that a little bit, or talk to all of us? And first of all, I'm sorry, I think I called you Soli earlier. I know.
Honestly, I didn't even realize it, but thank you so much, Laura. Yes, I remember you mentioning that when we were prepping for this, and I really, really loved hearing that, because that's also a thing I want readers to take from this. This is one person's journey, right? This is one person's political awakening. This is one person's take on what it means to be Catholic. This is not the only take, right? And I wanted people to understand that it is a journey, and no matter where you are, no matter how scary these things can be, right? Because it is terrifying to realize, oh, okay, I have a lot of work to do, but there's also so much history that I don't know. Like, I had never thought about what it means to talk about neoliberalism. I never realized what it was to talk about abolition until I started doing this book, until I started the research for this book. And I want people to know that it is okay to say, hey, I don't actually know what abolition means. I don't know what it means to be critical of imperialism, but I want to learn more. And the book for me was the first step for me to do that. I wanted people to know that it is okay to be learning publicly. It is okay to say, hey, here's how I'm thinking about these things. I'm reading these books for the first time. I'm engaging with these topics for the first time, and you can too, because I think, especially as Catholics, especially as Christians, that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be afraid to do that work. We shouldn't be afraid to sit with things that we've never sat with before. And that's why I loved hearing you describe the journey part, because it was a journey for me, and it's still a journey for me. Like, there are parts of my book that I'm reading now, and I'm like, oh, wow, you have grown in the 4 months since your book has published, and that's okay, right? Like, we're supposed to constantly be evolving and constantly changing and constantly challenging ourselves. And that's why I hope people engage with the book in that way as well. I hope people say, okay, if Olga just started talking about empire and imperialism, then I can start talking about it too, right? Like I'm 31 years old and I've never talked about these things, but I'm starting to talk about these things now and how it relates to our faith. And I think it's important to do that. And I hope that people understand that this is where our church is right now. We're all kind of trying to figure out what it means to do this work. And that is going to look very different from what it was a year ago or what it was 6 months ago. And so it is a journey. And I hope it's a journey that doesn't put people off. I hope that it invites people to say, oh, okay, if Olga can do this, then I can do it too. If Olga's engaging with this, then I can too, right? Because I'm not some unicorn in this space, right? I'm someone who is one person in this Black Catholic community who's engaging with this. And I hope that people feel challenged and welcome to step into this space.
The other thing during our discussions and again in reading your book, I really appreciated this sense that for me, as a person who's learning how my privilege affects my viewpoint and my actions, you give me the freedom to experiment and not have it all together. Like you've said a few times in what you just shared, we're all figuring it out.
Right.
And I really appreciate that. And
yeah.
I think when you're learning more about how your sense of privilege, you know, I have to say, I think the first place I learned about privilege was probably when I was in high school and I was shopping with my girlfriend and a security guard came up. You know how when women are shopping, like you kind of drift apart a little bit. And the security guard came up to me and pointed at my friend who's Black. And he said, "Is she with you?"
Oh, wow.
And I, my brain, as usual, was about 3 seconds behind my mouth. And I said, "Yeah." And I didn't really pay attention. And I just stopped. And that was kind of a light for me. Like I was like, so I really appreciate how your approach is, hey, let's figure this out, because we have to have that room to experiment.
And I think one thing, thank you so much for sharing that. One thing that I also tried, and not just with the book, but when I talk about the book as well, one thing that I really want to hammer home for people is that acknowledging that you have privilege, especially as a white person, doesn't mean that you're this awful human being. It just means that you were born into a system that has privileged you over other people, and you need to acknowledge that. You know, there's no way you can talk about what it means to be an ally, what it means to do this work, without first saying, okay, I acknowledge and understand that I have moved through this world in ways that other people have not moved through this world. And that's even the case for me too. You know, I'm someone who identifies as a Black Catholic immigrant, but I also have lighter skin. I have lighter skin than my sister. I have lighter skin than my father. And acknowledging that means that, yes, I'm acknowledging my privilege, but let's continue this work, right? It's not an excuse, or it's not just to say I can't do the work or to victimize myself. It's just, hey, let's acknowledge that I move through the world very differently than my partner does, who is a dark-skinned Black man, right? Like these are the conversations that we have to have, because that shouldn't, making that acknowledgement shouldn't be so scary. Acknowledging that we have privilege shouldn't be so scary, right? And I think that's another thing that I like to really, really tell people when they're engaging with the book. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging your privilege, because you know what? We can see the privilege that you walk with throughout the world. When I look at a white person, I know that there's privilege that they have had in spaces that I have not even been invited into. But that doesn't mean that that realization is preventing them from doing this work. And I think that's a genuine discomfort and tension that prevents a lot of white Catholics in particular from entering into these spaces. And that's why, again, I'm so grateful that you're sharing your own experience, Lori, because I think it's important for white Catholics to know, hey, acknowledging my privilege doesn't mean that I'm going to be automatically erased from this work, or that I'm going to automatically be prevented from doing this work. Actually, this is a part of the process, right? We need more white people to say, hey, I do have white privilege. I am benefiting from a system that's oppressing you. Now let's figure out how to make it so that the system benefits not just people who look like me, you know? And so that's another thing that I hope it helps people do. When we talk about this journey, the journey has to begin with you saying, okay, how am I privileged? How am I not privileged, right? Like the conversation goes both ways. People from marginalized groups also talk about privilege, right? And this is how we do that work. And so I hope that people feel encouraged to not be afraid to say, hey, I've been really, really comfortable and I've moved through the world without many obstacles. Now, how am I going to make it so that other people can move through the world without obstacles and with the same privilege and comfort, et cetera, you know?
We all wonder what we can do to help.
Hmm.
There's one very practical thing is self-examination and
Hmm.
reflection. And
Hmm.
it's amazing, reading your book, Olga, also a couple of different other experiences I've had in the last year. When you decide to look for it, you're just like, oh, ooh, oh, you'll find it, and that's
Hmm.
okay. You can let it
Hmm.
go and acknowledge it and move on.
Right,
It's
right.
really, you come from a family of writers, you're a writer, but yet,
Hmm.
you know, a lot of people have that experience, and yet less than 1% of them will actually sit down and write.
Hmm.
So what do you think it is? And it may seem an obvious question, but I don't want to assume here. What do you think it is that really inspired you? Like, okay, this is my moment and this is what I want to say.
Yeah, to be perfectly honest and to kind of follow up on speaking about privilege, I think that I was at a perfect moment in Catholic media where, after years of working and covering this movement, other people in Catholic spaces started to pay attention to this movement. And I'm really, really grateful for Father James Martin, who is the reason why Orbis reached out to me with a book review. I can't, honestly, at this point, I can't remember if I mentioned that in the book or not, but Orbis reached out to him and said, "Hey, are there any writers who you think are deserving of this sort of platform?" And he suggested my name, and then I received information
Oh,
from Orbis, and so that is the number one. I was, again, acknowledging my own privilege in that very particular space. I think
mhm.
also what has happened in the past few years, I think Catholic media, a lot of Catholic media is finally catching up, or not finally catching up, but I think we're finally publicly talking about how white Catholic media actually is. And I think that when people started to pay attention to the whiteness of Catholic media, I think because it is so white, my work started to stand out in a way that it never had before, because I was covering this movement since 2013, 2014. Virtually no one was really engaging with my early articles on Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
Um, and then in recent years, especially with social media, we've seen how much police violence in particular has been shared on social media. I think that really pushed a lot of people in Catholic spaces to want to have those conversations, to want to start doing a little bit of that self-reflecting in public spaces and saying, okay, how do we talk about what it means to be Catholics who don't talk about white privilege? What does it mean
Mhm.
to be Catholics and actually care about racial justice work, right? And I think I had been doing a lot of that work. And so when people finally sort of started catching up to that conversation, I
Mhm.
think that's why people were much more comfortable. I think also, I think when I got my book deal, I think it was a huge turning point with people in media really wanting to hold themselves accountable in ways that they never had before. Because I think it was prior to that, I was almost the only person publicly really talking about these things. Obviously, there are others. I don't want to erase anyone, but I was one of the few people at these big sort of Catholic legacy publications who was doing this work. But I think it's one of those things that until something really, really big happens, people kind of are just like, yes, racism is this thing. And obviously, because we're in very Catholic spaces, racism is this thing, but it's not as big of a thing as all these other issues that we care about more. And I think that that has been the attitude for a very long time for a lot of Catholics in media. And I think that in recent years in particular, people have just been challenged in ways that they never had before. And I think I talked about my political awakening. I think that's something that a lot of people have experienced in the past 2 years. And I think that all of that sort of culminating together helped made it easy for me to be able to say, oh, okay, now I can do this work. Because even if you look at my early work compared to my work of the last year, I was also very cautious with the way I talked about racism, because I understood the dynamic that we were in, right? I understood that white Catholics weren't ready to have the conversations about racism that they started having in 2020. But it's kind of, for Black writers in Catholic spaces, you're often just kind of biding your time and waiting for people to kind of catch up to the work that you're already doing. And I think that in the past year, especially, Catholics are finally starting to wake up to the reality of, oh, wait, racism is not just this one thing that exists under this racism bubble. It's also intersectional, right? We can't talk about what it means to do reproductive justice as Catholic, reproductive justice work as Catholics, or immigration work as Catholics. We can't talk about any of that without also thinking about the role that racism plays. And I think the Catholic world is finally catching up to that. And I think that is why it was not easier, because it was not an easy book writing process, but I think that's why it was easier to find an audience for this, for my work in 2020 in a way that I never had before.
Mm. It's really approachable.
Mm.
You know, for someone learning about the topic and learning, I don't know a better word than approachable. Like I walked right along with you through
Mhm.
it, and
Mhm.
I could see your passion in your writing. It really, you accomplished your goal.
Thanks, Lori. Thanks.
You know, one of the things I loved about the book is I really took a lot of notes as far as people I wanted to look up, read about.
Mhm.
So as you think about people you quoted or maybe interviewed, or
Mhm.
your own inspirations, would you talk about a few people that particularly helped you with this theme and what you've learned about it?
Yeah, for sure. The first person I will start off with might be familiar to some NCR folks because he's written for NCR before. His name is Dwayne David Paul. He works at the Collaborative Center for Justice. I often get the name where he works at wrong, so I think it's Collaborative Center for Justice in Connecticut. And he is someone who we became friends on social media. We became friends like many people do in the digital age. We were friends online before we were friends in real life. And ever since I followed him online, he's always been very committed to helping Catholics think about justice more deeply. And he's always been someone who is very, very critical of American imperialism and who was using a lot of this language before I fully internalized it. And he is one of the first people who really got me thinking about abolition from a Catholic context. He helped me to understand that as Catholics, if we are committed to caring for one another, if we're committed to building a world where everyone has everything that they need to survive, where everyone is treated as worthy, right, where we're all committed to this idea of the common good, then we needed to work toward a world free of prisons and free of a prison industrial complex, and this includes law enforcement, that terrorizes people, that terrorizes any sort of marginalized group. And he was the first person who really, really got me thinking about what it means to do abolitionist work as a Catholic and why it's necessary to do that kind of work as a Catholic. And he is just someone who challenges me. He challenges me in a way, I talk about, I hope my book helps people understand that it is okay to not know things, but it's still important to challenge yourself. He is someone who's always challenging me to think more deeply about things that make me feel really uncomfortable sometimes, and that I sometimes have to sit with and think, wow, this is making me feel really, really weird. Why do I have these feelings? How have I been conditioned to think about these things? And he's someone who has been extremely crucial to my own my own writing and sort of to my own faith life. And then along with Dwayne David Paul, it's Clarissa Brooks, who is a Gen Z activist writer who started writing a lot more in 2020 as all of these things were happening. And she is someone who, I believe she's about 23, 24. And when I started following her, she was being critical of capitalism in a way that it took me writing an entire book to finally be comfortable doing. And she is someone who is really helping me understand how Gen Z is so much more comfortable being explicitly critical of the United States in a way that I think it's important for us to do. And she's the first one who gave me the language to be critical of capitalism. I interviewed her, and I mentioned this in the book, I interviewed her for a piece I was originally writing for The Guardian last year, and she talked about how capitalism affected her everyday life. And this was something that up until that point, I had only been thinking about capitalism as this sort of macro thing, right? And she helped me to say, no. This system exploits us every single day, and here is how. So she helped me to really connect the dots with the context and the histories that I was learning for the first time and connecting it to the everyday things that I was seeing in my own life, in my own community, especially during COVID-19, right? I'm in the Bronx, and my area in the Bronx is extremely, the socioeconomic class is much lower than Manhattan and other places in the Bronx. And at the start of the pandemic, you couldn't find a test around here. You couldn't even find doctors in some of the urgent cares in these areas. And so she helped me to think about how that's directly connected to what it means to maintain American imperialism. And the both of them have really just been so crucial to me unlearning the sort of revisionist history that we're taught in the United States, and also helping me to use that unlearning to then think about my faith in a much deeper way. So I think those are two people, Dwayne David Paul and Clarissa Brooks, who have really been instrumental to me. And this is why I wanted to include their voices in the book, because I wanted people to encounter their work and to be challenged by it the same way that I was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're having a question come in from one of our participants. I'd like to ask you now because I think it'll have bearing on how you answer. They're asking for your definition of the word abolitionist.
Oh, sure. So abolitionist, the way I defined, or my understanding of what it means to be an abolitionist, is someone who wants to essentially abolish prisons and jails, but also someone who believes that we do not need to be constantly surveilled by law enforcement. An abolitionist is someone who understands that if we give people everything that they need to survive, then we could eliminate the need to have law enforcement who will oppress these communities, right? I think for me, the way I define what it means to be an abolitionist is, again, thinking in sort of my own community. I live in the Bronx, and I live in a part of the Bronx that is heavily surveilled by the NYPD, and even more so in the pandemic. And for me, I think about, if we lived in a world where prisons and police officers weren't a thing, then my community wouldn't be so fearful. Like the people in my community, we operate and we move differently when we know police officers are around, and we know that we have conversations with our partners and our kids when we know we're stepping out into the world. And so for me, being an abolitionist means believing in a world where people who have been oppressed by this prison industrial complex are no longer oppressed, in a world where we are thinking about eliminating all of the systems that incarcerate and then exploit people from my communities, right? And so I think, and again, this is not a 100% perfect definition of abolitionist. This is just sort of the way I am defining these things. So it is okay. Again, I think it's important to learn these things in public, and this definition might be very different in 6 months, but that's sort of how I interpret that, especially as Catholics. I think, especially under Pope Francis's papacy, right? He challenges us to think about the most marginalized people in society, right? And some of the most marginalized people in society are people who are in prisons, are people who are not treated as worthy just because they are incarcerated. You know, I have family in prison systems across the country, and seeing the way that they were treated throughout the pandemic, we cannot exist in a world where people are kept in solitary confinement just because we do not want to provide them with the vaccine, or just because we don't want to test them out. And I think any system that prevents people from being their full, authentic human self, and a system that doesn't treat us human beings as worthy, are systems that we should theoretically be opposed to as Catholics.
Wow. That whole section in your book, I learned a lot. I didn't know different things about how people were imprisoned and how I was just like, oh my gosh, like one day somebody got out of bed and decided this was a good idea. I mean, it was quite amazing to me. I would like to get you a question that really kind of gets at the heart of what your book is about, and that is the intersection of our Catholic belief, particularly our social justice teachings, and the Black Lives Matter movement. And you see a real strong connection there. And in fact, you believe we can learn a lot about how to live out our values based on the Black Lives movement. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned earlier, this movement was born at a time when I was also figuring out what it meant to be a Catholic, and also what it meant to be a Catholic in very public sort of digital spaces. And I started to see similarities with the movement when and again, this sort of anecdote on my end, I found myself moving away from the church in my mid-20s, because I thought, okay, here is my very real Black immigrant existence, and here's how the church is completely ignoring that. Here's how the church is not really thinking about what it means to center my experience and to challenge white Catholics to center my experience. But then came this movement that was very, very militant and straightforward and saying, okay, here's what this movement stands for, right? We stand in solidarity with all oppressed peoples everywhere, especially workers. We are a movement that is committed to censoring the most marginalized. We are committed to abolishing law enforcement. We are committed to abolishing prisons. We are committed to working together to create spaces where everyone is treated equally. And so engaging with this movement, I started reading their mission statement and reading the works of the three founders. And that was the time where I was like, wait a minute, this feels very Catholic to me. This feels very, very Catholic to me, because this is exactly what Catholic social teaching tells us to do, right? Catholic social teaching tells us we're supposed to be concerned with workers all across the world. We're supposed to stand in solidarity with one another. We're supposed to value all human life. We're supposed to strive toward a world where everyone is given the love and dignity that God tells us that they deserve. And this movement basically gave me a blueprint to talk about these things, right? I'm someone who didn't feel at home in a lot of the Catholic spaces I was in. And a lot of these white Catholic spaces weren't challenging me to think more deeply about the gospel. They weren't encouraging me to think about how my experience mattered. And then this movement came around and really got me thinking about, oh, okay, here's what it means to do Catholic social teaching, because here's how this movement is overlapping. Here's how what they're saying sounds almost exactly like what I'm hearing or internalizing from Pope Francis and Catholic social teaching. And here is how I can use that to also help Catholics think more deeply about Catholic social teaching. Because I think, and I get this a lot, I think that one of the biggest tensions that people have with this movement is that they automatically think, well, they're not Catholic, they're not affiliated with any single religion, so we can't as Catholics engage with that. When it's, I like to say the opposite, right? I like to say, hey, if we believe that God created everything on this planet, that everything around us is somehow related to how we think about what it means to be faithful people, then how can this movement challenge us to be better, right? I think that how I've learned to be an adult Catholic has been in secular spaces. And so this is why I like to talk about these similarities, right? Because this movement helped me think more about Catholic social teaching. It wasn't priest at Fordham, it wasn't sitting with the Bible, it wasn't all of these things that didn't really speak to me. It was this movement that really challenged me to say, oh, okay, if this is what it means to be in solidarity with all oppressed peoples, then how can we do that as Catholics? How are we not doing that as Catholics? How are our bishops not doing that as Catholics, right? And so I think the similarities are there. I think that the similarities are there because ultimately, as Catholics, our institutional church and this movement, literally building, operating from like what the Black Lives Matter mission statement in particular means, we're all striving for a world where all people are free, where all people are allowed to thrive as a community, not as individuals, but as a community, right? And that's what spoke to me the most, the fact that there's this emphasis on, we're not going to build anything, we're not going to abolish the things that are destroying us individually. We're not going to internalize capitalism and become rich overnight and have everything we need. No, no, no. We have to do this collectively. We have to work together and build the world that we want to see. And I think that those are the similarities for me. That's what I've been thinking about this movement. That's how I've been challenged to think about this movement. And that's how I see the two, the Catholic Church and the movement, overlapping.
Kind of along that line, when you and I were talking about ideas for what we could discuss at this session, we were talking about this movie, and we both discovered an inner geekdom. But the movie is called Arrival, and the idea of the movie is that aliens come, and of course everyone's just afraid of them. They're afraid, they're different, they don't know what it's all about. And it really is this woman scientist who is very Franciscan. Instead of wanting to speak, she wanted to listen. And she did not stop until she could understand what they were saying. And once she was able to do that, there was a real connection with these new people. And this idea of listening and seeking to understand. So as with everything you've said, where is it in the church right now Or is there any place in the church right now where you feel like someone is really seeking to understand? They want to understand. They want to understand what's happening. They want to understand how to influence and help. They want to understand the negative experiences that so many of our brothers and sisters are experiencing just by virtue of their color of their skin. Where do you feel heard and listened to, and that someone is there? She was at that window every day trying to hear, trying to understand it. It was actually quite moving in a couple of points in the movie. Do you feel that anywhere?
I definitely feel that in the Black Catholic spaces that I'm in the very POC Catholic spaces that I'm in. I think in the past year in particular, we've seen a lot of Catholics become so frustrated, marginalized Catholics in particular, become so frustrated with the church that they're essentially starting their own spaces, right? They're starting things like podcasts, they're starting private blogs that they share amongst each other. And I think in these more intimate spaces that, again, of course, are very much signs of the times. We've been socially isolated, and many of us in lockdown for quite a long time. And so a lot of these spaces have sprung up in the past year. And I think that those are the spaces where I'm feeling the most heard, because these are spaces that are non-white spaces where we as Black Catholics are able to share our experiences in a way that's very much removed from the white gaze. We don't often get to operate publicly in spaces where the white gaze doesn't accompany what we do. And so these spaces have been crucial to me, not just because I'm being heard, but also because I'm talking to people who understand. I'm talking to people who, when I say, you know what, I woke up today and I just can't do it. I just cannot do it. My anxieties, my fears have just gotten the best of me. And to be able to be in a space where instead of having to explain that, the response is, I know, I get it. And it's not providing solutions. It's not trying to fix racism in the church in this country, because we all of us do that in our public lives. But those spaces give me the space to heal, and they give me the space to continue to keep doing the work that I do every day. Because if I didn't have those spaces where I could be heard in a very private, intimate way, I think it would be very difficult for me to continue doing this work. And I think where we're not being heard is, and I know anyone who has seen me speak knows that this is something I rant about often, but I don't think the bishops collectively, I think there are a lot of individual bishops who we've seen in the past year really, really challenging themselves to talk about what it means to be white men, in particular, part of a group of mostly white men at this moment. We've seen a lot of them who are doing this work, but I think collectively, there's still so much work to do. And sometimes it feels like I am having a very specific conversation about the Black Catholic experience and about what it means to exist in this country in this moment. And sometimes it feels like our institutional leaders are not hearing any of that. I think that they operate, they are very much thinking about the things that they see as the preeminent, most crucial topics and issues to worry about. And they are ignoring the cries of Catholics like me, who are like, hey, we are dying in the street, and not just at the hands of police violence and the prison industrial complex and capitalism and all these things. We're also dying because we're anxious. We're scared all the time. And that is extremely paralyzing. And it is extremely difficult to have to constantly feel like, oh, okay, let me try once again to get our leaders to actually pay attention to the things that matter to us. And I think that is most where I feel that we're not being heard. And I think that, and I mentioned this in the book, I think our bishops have a lot of work to do, because there are Catholics who listen to them, and there are Catholics who are not going to listen to me when I say that, hey, we need to do abolitionist work. Hey, we need to talk about defunding the police. But they might listen to other bishops, to bishops in our church who they see as having, who they perceive as having more power than me. And I think that is why I'm so grateful for this question, because I think it's important to say, hey, the USCCB in particular, you guys are not paying attention to what we are saying. And we notice this because the things that you prioritize are not the things that we are telling you should prioritize, right? And I think that I'm grateful for the spaces that I am in. And I'm also grateful for the white Catholics who, in the past year, have really used the pandemic to say, hey, I'm going to raise funds to support this organization. I'm going to talk to my white Catholics in my life and my family about being better and about doing this work. I also think it's important. I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff happening at the grassroots local level that I'm really, really moved by in the past year. But I still think that the institutional church, I think our hierarchy needs to do a better job of listening. I know they say that they have a lot of listening sessions and they have groups of people who talk to them about things, but these things need to be more public. And I think they need to be an ongoing thing, right? If we're talking about this work being a journey, then that means that it is ongoing. It means that it's not just let me release a statement and then move on to the next thing. We know that when they want to organize, they can organize. And so that's where I think that I want to see how our leaders are listening to us. I want to see them organize and show us that they're thinking about, hey, if Black Catholics are feeling so lonely in this church at this moment and they want us to give them spiritual guidance, let's do that work. And so that's where I think the listening needs to happen. I think there needs to be authentic listening and not just the listening that they claim to have been doing for years. I think that there needs to be a concerted effort to listen and to sit with that discomfort, to sit with people calling you out for your whiteness, for your power, for everything. And I think that once we start seeing more of that, I think a lot of Catholics like me will start to say, oh, okay, maybe you guys are listening more than we give you credit for, you know?
You know, it's interesting because one of the things I've been thinking about lately, I was in a discussion with a different topic with someone, and she kept using the word marginalized communities, and it really kind of stuck with me because I thought it's really actually grave matter to take the thing that God has defined as precious and dignified and push it out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's a grave matter situation. And to not listen, to not attend, and actually to put the burden of fixing it on the people you pushed aside is even more grave matter. And so I hope that soon, you know, my joke about the Catholic Church is, oh, do you have a problem? Because we have an office for that. And instead, we got to be willing to do the personal, difficult work, whatever our station is. So,
agreed.
we have a couple of questions, Olga. Somebody is asking if you have thoughts about critical race theory and the idea that in some places there are laws that it has to be included in school and college, university curriculums.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. I know that there has been obviously a lot of discussion about critical race theory. I think it's extremely important to have classes that focus on, that are dedicated to critical race theory. I think one of the things that I realized writing this book is that I would have benefited from having very explicit conversations about what it means to think about how we define race in this country and in this world. And I think that it is important for us to have that context. We can't talk about doing this work without thinking about the very real ways that race plays, the various roles that race plays in virtually every industry in this country. And I think that people who are opposed to it, I think, again, are operating from a lot of the times a place of fear, right? Because everyone is afraid of having to say, hey, I actually have never thought about racism. I have never had to think about racism because my privilege has allowed me to never have to think about those things. And I think it's okay to say that. I think it's okay to say, hey, I don't want to be challenged. It's scary for me to be challenged. However, we need to learn about these things. We need to give Americans in particular the critical lens to be able to talk about racism. One of the things that in my years of reporting demonstrated just how little we engage with critical race theory is when people would talk about racism and they would define it as something that we are all capable of doing. They describe it as discrimination that everyone is capable of doing against anyone. And we saw this even in the bishop's 2018 letter, Open Wide Our Hearts. The ways that they define racism, the ways that they define what it means to do that work is completely incorrect, because racism is a system racism is systemic, right? Racism is something that privileges that creates very specific privileges for certain people. And we need to be able to talk about how systemic racism is. We need to be able to distinguish between racism and discrimination. We need to be able to talk about anti-Blackness, which is something I'm capable. People in my community are capable of being anti-Black, but they are not capable of being racist, right? Because there's a level of power involved in what it means to be racist. And I think this is why it's so crucial for people to talk about these things, because especially for Catholic universities and Catholic high schools in particular, these are spaces where theoretically you could allow people to have very uncomfortable conversations, right? Because we're not saying that critical race theory means that everyone is going to think the same. No, it's just saying, okay, we're going to learn how to talk about these things. And then we're going to have awkward conversations in these theoretically safe spaces, right? I like to point to Father Brian Mastingale, who I got to profile before the pandemic. And in his graduate classes, he talks to his white students about very, very difficult things. And he creates a space where not everyone is in agreement, but everyone is able to have a back and forth conversation with each other, and they're able to challenge each other and think about what it means to learn these things together, right? I think that the backlash to critical race theory is that this country doesn't empower us to be comfortable, especially in the digital age. It's become very difficult to engage with things as a community in a way that doesn't lead to polarization, right? And I think that that's what we're seeing a lot with a lot of the response, not all of it, but some of the response I've been seeing to states banning critical race theory. A lot of it has to do with, well, we don't want to have white kids having awkward conversations. We don't want white kids to have to think about really, really difficult things at such a young age. But the reality is, we should be thinking about difficult things at a young age, but we have to think about these things in a space where we can say, hey, you've learned about this really incorrectly, but let's talk about how to learn about it better. And I think that critical race theory is important, just like everything that we learn, the whole point in a sort of utopic world, the whole point of education is to help us, or at least in my mind, I imagine education to help people, educational spaces to be spaces where people can engage with things that they don't agree with, but that informs how they view the world around them. And I think, how are we supposed to have Black and white kids, non-white kids in educational spaces, but not talk to them about the fact that they're going to be treated very differently in the world? And why have we constructed what it means to think about Black students versus white students? And I think it's important to talk to people about that, because so many people are concerned with not having difficult conversations with white kids at very young ages. But the reality is, as Black kids, we have had those difficult conversations our whole life. My partner, when he was 10, he was at a pool party with his school friends, and he pushed a little girl into, the way kids do, you're 10, you're playing around. He pushed a girl into a pool, and his parents, the conversation they had with him was, you're a dark-skinned Black kid, you cannot move through the world in that way. And these are conversations that we have to have with our kids. And so how much easier would it be if we had educational spaces that are like, oh, okay, here's a conversation that people have to have, and because of this, let's have a conversation with white kids about why those Black kids have to live in a world where they have a conversation, but your adolescence is privileged. I think that, yeah, we just need to, I think it's super important. And I think in the past 4 years, we have seen just how little people actually understand about critical race theory in the United States, and how little people actually understand about what it means to be marginalized groups in this country. And so I think it's important. And I think the backlash is unfortunately coming from a lot of conservative states that just do not want to give up all of the laws and policies that benefit white people. I think there is that discomfort and that power that white Americans just do not want to give up.
I don't want to give it up. No, I'm just kidding. I like power. No, I'm just kidding. No, but it's really, ultimately that's what it is. It's asking us to be willing to let it go. And we have to acknowledge that's just a hard thing to do no matter what The
Mhm,
question
mhm,
is
mhm.
if a person has power to let it go,
Right.
to give it out, and you're right. We're coming close to the end. I have two questions left. One seems to
Mhm.
be a little shorter and one a little longer.
Okay.
The short question is, are you using the terms Black Lives Movement and Black Lives Matter as an organization? Are you using them interchangeably?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to use them interchangeably because I've sat and reported on the movement itself and have talked about how the movement talks about its mission statement and how that mission statement has now entered sort of the zeitgeist. So I use them interchangeably, but I understand that often people make a distinction. I think some people like to separate the movement from the organization. And I understand, especially this year, there have been a lot of legitimate concerns from a lot of the families of victims of police brutality who have raised valid concerns about the organization, especially in terms of its fundraising. But I often use both interchangeably because, again, we're talking about context, right? I have all of the context of this movement, but I think a lot of people in the church struggle with that context too. And I think, again, that's why it's important to have these public conversations and to talk about these things, because I think, especially for Catholics in the last year, a lot of Catholics have engaged with the slogan and engaged with, oh, Black Lives Matter. This is a a sentiment that I want to share to, because once you say that statement, you can sort of understand where someone stands politically. So I understand that urge, but I don't think it can be separated from the movement itself, right? Because we need to have the context of both. So I tend to use both interchangeably.
Thank you.
Mhm.
This question is asking you for kind of some practical advice. It says that one of our participants' observations is that people really can't process the idea of being critical of capitalism. They kind of freeze up. Hello,
Mhm.
isn't that the
Mhm.
truth? And she's wondering, or he's wondering, pardon me, what are some basic questions or concepts that they could talk about with our friends or family to help foster this conversation?
Yeah, for sure. I think some of the wonderful starting points are some of the people I mentioned earlier, Dwayne David Paul and Clarissa Brooks, two thinkers who really got me thinking about capitalism. And they did it in a way where it wasn't, yes, they have very explicit critical concerns about capitalism, but it's more the everyday realities of how capitalism affects us. And I think those are two starting points. I think engaging with their work and engaging with people's work who are helping us think about the sort of everyday daily realities of how this system oppresses us, because I understand that 2 years ago I would not have been critical of capitalism. I was very much that person who said, you know what, I just have to work hard enough and I will save hard enough and then I can help everyone around me. And the reality is I've been working for 15 years since my first job at the New York Public Library, and my sort of socioeconomic condition, or my socioeconomic class, the socioeconomic class I'm in, hasn't really changed that much. My parents have been working for over 30 years in this country, and they're going to have to work very well into retirement. So I think operating from that, I think doing it more sort of inward looking out, if that makes sense, thinking about, wait a minute, why have I not been able to advance myself despite working really hard? Or why is it that because I live in this particular neighborhood, I have had access to this type of education versus not have had access to that type of education? Or in the pandemic, why is it that certain neighborhoods in certain states have had more access to resources than other neighborhoods? And I think
Mhm.
breaking it down in that way and just breaking down the fact that there are very real everyday inequalities is a good starting point for people that will ultimately, I hope, get people to the point where I am at now, where I'm like, oh, okay, the system is the problem, right? The system succeeds because some of us are oppressed. But I think that those are starting points that I would give to some people. Engage with the work of thinkers like Dwayne David Paul, Clarissa Brooks, but also ask yourself in your everyday life, like, why haven't my material conditions improved despite me working hard every single day? And I think there's a lot of, we talked about earlier, Lori, the self-reflection. I think there's a lot of self-reflection. The reason I have been able to arrive at this is, yes, mostly because of the thinkers who have helped me, but also I have had very sort of devastating moments in the past year where I have been like, wait a minute, why don't I have access to certain things? Why does my community not have access to certain things, right? And I think once you sit with those questions, and again, also contextualize a lot of, provide yourself context, right? Because there's a lot of reading that has to happen. I think once you start doing that, then you start to connect the dots yourself a little bit better. But again, that's my journey, and I hope that that is helpful for folks who are asking that question. Because again, it's not, I didn't wake up one night to the next and think like, I'm going to criticize empire and this is what I'm going to do. No, it took me almost 10 years in Catholic media and a lot of reading to even understand how to name these things, right? Like, I don't even still fully understand neoliberalism. So one thing I'm doing now is trying to understand that more deeply and to connect that to like the world that I'm seeing today. And so I just encourage folks to really do that reading. I know this is a cliche at this point, but reading is really, really important for this because there's so much revisionist history in our academic spaces that also promote a certain specific agenda. And I think it's just challenging yourself to do that work, right? I think that is the discomfort, right? It's uncomfortable to say like, oh, wow, I'm never going to be super wealthy. I'm never going to be rich enough to give my parents everything they need. Why, right? Like, why is that? And I think once you start asking yourself those questions, and I think you will naturally start saying, okay, well, then how do I define this? Like, how do I define the systems that have created these inequalities? So I hope that was kind of helpful.
Oh, I think so. We're at the hour, but I would like to ask before we go, if as you know, you're speaking to our members, and these are our really engaged donors and readers. So I'm sure could you just give us a couple words about your role as culture editor, what you do, and any ways we can help you do it?
Oh, sure. Thank you for that, Laura. So I am the culture editor, the opinion and culture editor at NCR. And I am really excited about that. That was something that I think when I first started working for Heidi, I was like, hey, I also do culture stuff. So if you want me to do culture stuff, like I would gladly do that. And I just took over our culture department earlier this year. And the reason and I'm going to start from here because I think this ultimately explains how I think about NCR's culture department. Culture, I grew up in a family of storytellers, and the way we learned how to tell stories, or the way we sort of became social critics in my home, is that we would watch films, we would watch shows, we would listen to music, we would read books, and then we would discuss those as a family. And so that is what I'm trying to do with NCR's culture department. I'm trying to help Catholics understand that there are so many different ways that we can think about what it means to be Catholic in this world. And there are so many ways to define our faith and to think about how our faith should be in our daily life. And I think culture is the way to do that. I love taking something that doesn't feel explicitly Catholic and then saying, hey, here's how Catholics should think about this. Here's why Catholics should be challenged by this. And that's what I'm hoping to do as the culture editor. I'm hoping to surprise people with the sort of cultural things that I'm thinking about, but also give space to other Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian writers, all writers from marginalized groups, the space to also dictate what it means to think about culture in Catholic spaces. I think for a long time, I mentioned this earlier, Catholic media has been very, very white. And so the way we define what it means to talk about the Catholic imagination, to talk about Catholic consumers of culture, has been very white. And so I want to allow BIPOC communities to dictate what it means to think about culture, especially in a Catholic context. And so that's what I'm hoping to accomplish in this role.
Well, thank you. You're just a joy. It's a joy to speak with you. Your joy is contagious, and it's just really amazing to me that you deal with so many sober realities in your writing and in your life, and yet your spirit is such joy. And I'm really excited for your future at NCR. I'm excited to be your colleague, and I know we're going to see great things from you in the future too. So thank you for helping us. That's kind of how I think of it, Olga. Thank you for helping us live out the best part of ourselves and our ideals. I read this thing once that ideals are not, our ideals are like stars. We may never reach them, but it is by them we chart our course. And I feel like you laid out a lot of ideals for us, and I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Thank you for inviting me into the space.
So before we give it to for closing prayer, I want folks to know that you'll receive an email with a link to recording and a lot of the things that were referenced today. Olga, a couple folks are asking for that opening prayer that you use, the opening poem.
Okay.
So would you send that to us afterwards so I can include it in what folks
Yeah, for
receive?
sure, for sure.
So we'll take care of that and look for future emails. We will be meeting and talking very soon. My colleague Tony and I are going to talk about live events and continuing virtual events as well. And so we'll be seeking advice and thoughts and creative ideas from our members. So we're going to write to you and we hope you respond. So thank you for being here, everyone. It's just a joy to be with this community again. I always say my favorite part is when all of our member faces come spotting into the session. So it's great to see everyone. And with that, Olga, will you send us off?
Sure. So I will do just a sort of quick, awkward prayer. It's in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God, thank you so much for bringing us into community today. And I just pray that everyone takes the conversation we've had today and just uses it to not just challenge themselves, but to also think about what it means to create a fully liberated world, and a world where everyone is given the God-given dignity and love that they deserve. And I hope that today's conversation inspires everyone to go into their own respective spaces and to think more deeply about what it means to do this work, and to do this work knowing that the ultimate goal is literally what Jesus preaches in the gospel, right? We are supposed to love each other. And what does it mean to create a world where we fully internalize that and we live that out? And so I pray that all of us become a part of this work and do this work in our respective circles. Amen.
Amen. If my mom were here, she would say, bring it on, God. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, everyone. Until next time. Bye. Bye, everybody.